All right, it's Dr. Jordan Taylor again, back with another edition of Fitness Facts. And on this episode, we are going to cover nutrition guidelines to optimize muscle protein synthesis. So the overview, we'll talk about the amount of protein that you should consume, protein source, talk about the amino acid leucine, which I've also talked about on some of the other videos I've done on protein. We'll talk about carbohydrate and fat co-ingestion with protein, the hormone insulin, protein timing and frequency, protein timing before sleep, protein intake when you're on a calorie restricted diet. For instance, maybe you're kind of reducing calories to shed body fat if you're a fitness competitor before a bodybuilding show, and also then some take-home points. So amount of protein, 20 grams of protein gives a near maximal increase in muscle protein synthesis after resistance training. If you look at the graph there on the right, and this is from a study by Moore in 2009, the x-axis is grams of protein ingested after a resistance training session. The y-axis, the vertical axis, is the fractional synthetic rate, percent per hour. So in a lot of these studies, what they do to assess muscle protein synthesis is a tracer, a labeled amino acid is consumed within the protein shake that they were given. And then they do pre and post muscle biopsies, and they determine the rate at which that tracer is basically built into the muscle, right? So you can take a biopsy before, have them train, have them consume the protein shake at different grams, and then you can do a post biopsy and look at where that tracer has gone, how it's been integrated into the muscle. So you can measure then the fractional synthetic rate. So here you see that 20 grams of protein post workout, things are linear from 5 to 10 to 20, you have this linear increase, and then it starts to flatten off that curve. So there's not a big difference after a workout in muscle protein synthesis if you compare 20 grams ingested to 40 grams of protein ingested. However, you do see about a 10% higher rate in muscle protein synthesis if you consume 40 grams after a workout, after a resistance training session, compared to 20 grams. So you do get a little bit more bang for your buck by consuming more protein, 40 versus 20 grams after a workout, as far as stimulating muscle protein synthesis. All right, so what are the general recommendations per day? Generally, 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight is recommended for sedentary individuals, okay? And if you're trying to figure out what your body weight is in kilograms, you've got to take your weight in pounds and divide by 2.2, because 1 kilogram equals 2.2 pounds. And then you would multiply your weight in kilograms by 0.8. If you're a sedentary individual, not training, not exercising a lot, mainly sitting around and not doing a lot, generally you don't need as much protein. So that would give you your total daily amount in grams of protein that you should consume per kilogram of body weight. For most athletes, athletes are going to need more. They're more active to support muscle tissue. So they need anywhere between 1.4 to 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. For those with the specific goal of maximizing strength and muscle mass, a higher amount of protein, so 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day would be recommended for those individuals. Think of bodybuilders, again, athletes involved in strength, power sports, maybe football, maybe it's a discus thrower or shot putter. 2.3 grams per kilogram of body weight is recommended for individuals that are resistance training in a caloric deficit. So again, maybe this is someone preparing for a fitness competition, bodybuilder, they're They're consuming a lower number of calories per day than what's needed to maintain weight because they're trying to shed body fat. So in doing so, in that state, you need to bump up your protein intake so that you retain lean muscle mass and you don't start catabolizing and losing too much muscle when you're eating less calories per day and you're dieting to lose fat. So general recommendations per meal. Research shows about 0.40 grams per kilogram of body weight is the effective dose that's needed to optimally stimulate muscle protein synthesis with each meal. Okay, so how would you calculate this? I'm using myself as an example here. So remember, 1 kilogram is 2.2 pounds. Me right now, I currently weigh 175 pounds. So if you take my weight in pounds, divide by 2.2, my weight in kilograms is 79.55 kilograms. The next thing that I would do here to figure how many grams per meal I should be eating would take that 79.55 kilograms, my body weight, and multiply by 0.40, because that's the dose needed to optimally stimulate MPS at each meal, and you get your total grams that you should eat, or that I should eat per meal. 31.82 grams of protein per meal is going to be ideal for me based on my weight to optimally stimulate muscle protein synthesis each time I eat. Protein sources. So protein sources differ in their capacity to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. I hit on this in another video, but animal-based protein sources typically contain a greater amount of essential amino acids. These are complete protein sources. They have more of those 9 essential amino acids and appear more potent than plant proteins in stimulating muscle protein synthesis. However, ingesting a greater amount of plant protein can help compensate for the difference in stimulating muscle protein synthesis. So just, if you're vegan, vegetarian, just eat more of those plant proteins, okay? The main properties that determine the anabolic effect of protein are its digestion rate. So for instance, some proteins have a higher bioavailability, they're higher quality, they digest rapidly, they're absorbed easily. Milk, egg, whey protein, for example. Also, amino acid composition. So you look at whey, certain animal products, or animal proteins, they tend to be higher in leucine, and leucine acts kind of as a trigger to help stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And that's not to say that the other amino acids are important, because they all are. You need all of them, especially the essential ones. So if we look at protein source here and muscle protein synthesis, and just looking at the milk proteins, casein, so remember 80% of milk is comprised of casein. This is a slower digesting protein. So from the gastrointestinal tract, casein protein and the amino acids coming from it, they enter the bloodstream more slowly over time. And you see a lower fractional synthetic rate, lower rate of protein synthesis there. Casein hydrolysate. This is casein where the protein has been chemically cut into smaller pieces, so you see a little bit higher fractional synthetic rate there. And then whey, the green bar, this is a rapid digesting protein, and 20% of milk is comprised of whey. So consuming whey, the amino acids in that protein, they enter the blood very rapidly because of its quick digesting. And also whey has a higher essential amino acid content, including leucine. So it tends to be the most beneficial there for stimulating muscle protein synthesis, especially, very rapidly, like after a resistance training session. So whey, rapid digestion and absorption, plus lots of essential amino acids, including leucine, equals a greater anabolic or muscle growth, muscle building response. Leucine. So the amino acid leucine is thought to be the most potent at stimulating MPS, muscle protein synthesis. Peak plasma leucine concentrations following protein ingestion typically correlate or associate with muscle protein synthesis rates. So this supports the notion that protein digestion rate and the leucine content of a particular protein are important predictors for the anabolic effect of a protein source. Leucine is very important, but like I mentioned, it kind of acts as a trigger for stimulating muscle protein synthesis, but that's not to say that the other amino acids don't play a role in stimulating muscle protein synthesis and growth. This just shows a muscle cell here, this kind of square that's outlined in blue. Inside the muscle cell, we have some different enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that play a role in this signal transduction cascade, this cascade of arrows that ultimately leads to protein being built and synthesized in a muscle cell. So you see there leucine entering through that leucine transporter, having adequate leucine floating around in the blood because you've been consuming it from protein that you've been taking in. That leucine enters through that transporter, and it can switch on mTOR, which stands for mechanistic target of rapamycin. mTOR is an enzyme that when it's active, it's going to cause phosphorylation. You see that little circle with the P in it? mTOR adds on a phosphate group to this enzyme, P70S6K, and that enzyme is really plays a critical role in directing the ribosome, which is a part of the cell that's responsible for building protein. It's going to direct that ribosome along with some other translation initiation factors to start translating and building proteins inside the cell. The other thing that switches on mTOR is mechanical stress. So what causes mechanical stress on muscle? Well, resistance training, right? And exercise in general. So loading a muscle with weight, that's going to stress the cell, activates an enzyme there, AKT, also known as protein kinase B. That's a kinase enzyme that causes phosphorylation, an activation of mTOR, and then mTOR, you follow the pathway down. The signal transduction cascade is going to phosphorylate the enzyme P70S6K, and that's going to lead ultimately to protein synthesis. So this is why you build muscle, and muscles grow if you're building and accumulating more protein, synthesizing more protein in your cells. They're going to grow larger in size. And mechanical stress and loading of muscle with adequate loads and volume is going to be important, along with adequate amino acids circulating in the bloodstream, such as leucine. So what about carbohydrates consumed with protein and also fat co-ingestion with protein? Well, carbohydrates are known to slow down protein digestion. However, this doesn't negatively affect, it doesn't really have any effect on muscle protein synthesis. Adding large amounts of carbohydrates to protein does not improve post-exercise muscle protein synthesis rates. But wait, question there. Don't carbohydrates increase plasma insulin levels, and doesn't insulin promote muscle protein synthesis? I'll discuss that in a bit. You know, it used to be thought that, after a resistance training workout, you should take in, 30 grams of carbs or 40 grams of carbs with your protein because you'd get this, it would spike. The carbs cause the pancreas to release insulin, and that would help to shuttle more glucose and more amino acids into your cells, and you might get this bigger spike in muscle protein synthesis. Well, we'll talk about that in a bit, okay? Fat. Now, consuming fat with protein. It's unlikely to have an impact on muscle protein synthesis. However, fat may slow the digestion and absorption of protein and amino acids from food, from the gastrointestinal tract into the blood. So whole foods that are a mix of carbs, fat, and protein can effectively stimulate muscle protein synthesis, although protein will be less rapidly digested as, say, compared to if you just had a whey protein shake that's pretty much just pure protein. That's digested quick, absorbed. Those amino acids are in the blood. Within 30 minutes, you get a big spike. Whole foods, it's going to take longer to process them, right? To digest and absorb, break them down into their component parts. So you're going to, more slowly absorb the amino acids from the protein and whole foods into the blood, but you're still going to get a big, large, effective stimulation of muscle protein synthesis. So it's not to say that, a supplement is necessarily better than whole foods, right? They both have a place. So now to the insulin point here. Insulin does increase amino acid uptake into muscle cells, facilitates the transport of amino acids from the blood into muscles, but it does not appear to stimulate muscle protein synthesis under normal physiologic conditions. So when you have, normal basal levels of insulin. And there's a good review that covers this by Tromelin and colleagues that was published in 2015. Insulin does, however, stimulate muscle protein synthesis at supraphysiological levels. So this is where it would be taken, exogenously, extra insulin injected to create higher levels of insulin in the blood. And this is sometimes done, often illegally, by picking on, bodybuilders here, professional bodybuilders will sometimes inject insulin to create the supraphysiological level, and that can help stimulate muscle growth. But typical physiologic levels, it doesn't appear to stimulate muscle protein synthesis with just the normal insulin response, the normal amount of insulin that's released from the pancreas, say, after a meal, okay? Insulin does, though, physiologic levels of insulin, inhibit muscle protein breakdown, right? So, after you eat a meal, that insulin's released. It does help to obviously cause uptake of glucose into your cells and amino acids into your cells. Insulin's a storage hormone, and it prevents muscle protein breakdown as well. But only a small amount of circulating insulin is needed for a maximal effect. So small amount of insulin does a great job of inhibiting muscle protein breakdown. And to create just a small amount of insulin release, a simple protein shake alone can increase insulin levels in the blood enough, that release from the pancreas, to maximally inhibit muscle protein breakdown. So there's not necessarily a need to add carbohydrate and get a huge, massive spike in insulin. Just like a whey protein shake and just protein consumption in general can trigger a little insulin spike. That's going to help prevent muscle protein breakdown, right? Because remember, if you're breaking down muscle protein, anytime you're losing more muscle protein than what you're synthesizing, muscle's in a catabolic state, and you would be losing muscle mass if that's taking place over, say, days and weeks and months of time. This graph just shows that as long as amino acid concentrations are high in the blood, it does not matter if insulin levels are kept low or very high. Muscle protein synthesis rates are the same in all conditions, whether you have low insulin levels, the white bar, medium insulin levels, the gray, high insulin, the black, or very high insulin levels, the green. Muscle protein synthesis is pretty much the same across all those different insulin levels that are in the blood, as long as you have high amino acid concentrations circulating in the blood. Protein timing and frequency. So consuming protein during resting or non-exercised conditions, it's known that muscle protein synthesis peaks after 2 hours of amino acid ingestion and then rapidly returns to fasting levels. Now, this is without any exercise in the picture, right? Muscles are receptive to muscle protein synthesis and anabolism or building for only a short period of time when in non-exercised states, okay? Exercise and protein consumption, however, exercise potentiates muscle protein synthesis and is going to prolong the rate or the period of time that muscle protein synthesis can take place. So it kind of primes the muscle cells so that muscle protein synthesis can be taking place over a longer window of time. Okay, so again, exercise potentiates MPS and the overall anabolic effect of protein intake. Exercise heightens both the magnitude and duration of the muscle protein synthesis response And the combination of resistance training and adequate post-workout doses of protein has been shown to increase muscle protein synthesis for 24 to 48 hours post-exercise approximately. It may not quite be as long, that window, in trained individuals versus untrained, but yeah, typically you're going to have that window 24 to 48 hours after exercise where muscle protein synthesis can really be optimized and maximized if you're taking in an adequate amount of protein, say at each meal, every 4 to 5 hours after the exercise session. Now this shows, we've got muscle protein synthesis on this graph, basically looking at two groups from this study in 2012. So a protein-only group, the white bars, and a group that did a resistance training exercise bout and consumed protein right after it, okay? So protein intake alone without exercise, that's the white bars, stimulates muscle protein synthesis in the 1 to 3 hour period after ingestion. Subsequently, though, the muscle protein synthesis rates decline back down to what you see at fasted states or fasted rates. However, when resistance training exercise and protein are combined, the green bars, muscle protein synthesis rates increase at both 1 to 3 hours post-workout and 3 to 5 hours post-workout. So you see, again, that exercise kind of primes the cell to synthesize protein. You add in some protein through the diet, muscle protein synthesis is going to be increased for a longer period of time versus if there's no exercise done and you just consume protein, the protein synthesis spikes at 1 to 3 hours and then it starts dropping back down, okay? This study in 2009 by Bird and colleagues, titled Exercise Training and Protein Metabolism, Influences of Contraction, Protein Intake, and Sex-Based Differences. Again, the y-axis, you're looking at muscle protein synthesis, the x-axis, synthesis at rest, and then at 3 hours post-resistance training exercise, 24 hours post-resistance training exercise, and 48 hours post-exercise. Just shows that resistance training induces a sustained increase in muscle protein synthesis for up to 2 days, 48 hours, which likely sensitizes the muscle to feeding. As a result, feeding during this time should result in greater muscle protein synthesis response compared with feeding at rest. So this is where it's important, kind of the take-home point here is to consume somewhere between 20 to 40 grams of protein every 3 to 4 hours, if possible, after training sessions to maximize muscle protein synthesis across that 48-hour window that follows your resistance training bout, okay? So with protein timing and frequency, there's no restrictive anabolic window for protein intake after exercise. It used to be thought that, you've got to consume protein, immediately after a workout. And I think that is beneficial still, right, to go ahead and jumpstart your muscle protein synthesis, but the window's a lot longer than once thought, right? I mean, up to 24 to 48 hours, as long as you're getting in adequate doses during that time frame. So you got a much larger window than what used to be thought. However, if you're training in a fasted state, so let's say that, you went to sleep last night, 10 o'clock, you got up at 7, you're late for work, you didn't have any breakfast, nothing to eat, you work all morning, then over lunch is when you normally train because you have an hour, so you go in and get a 45-minute workout in, but you haven't eaten since 10 p.m. the night before. Well, in that fasted state, when you're training and you haven't eaten for that many hours, I do recommend you ingest 20 to 40 grams of high-quality, rapid digesting protein like a whey protein supplement immediately after your training session to go ahead and get those amino acids into the blood quickly, attenuate any muscle protein breakdown because you've been fasting and not eating, and you don't want to be, losing muscle mass. So you're shutting that off, right, by getting in that whey protein right after your workout. So that's important when you're in a fasted state. The anabolic window of opportunity for consuming protein and stimulating muscle protein synthesis after a workout, like I mentioned, is much larger than once thought because muscle is sensitized and primed for increasing muscle protein synthesis anywhere from 20 to 48 hours post-exercise. So it's not like you just have to get in all your protein or a bunch of protein within, immediately after a workout or within an hour. Like, you've got this long window there to get in adequate doses at each meal. If your goal is to maximize muscle gains, it makes sense to try to aim for at least a reasonable protein distribution throughout the day. So, for example, 4 to 5 protein-rich meals divided, across the day. So this study in 2013, titled Timing and Distribution of Protein Ingestion During Prolonged Recovery from Resistance Exercise, Alters Myofibrillar Protein Synthesis. Remember, myofibrillar proteins are the actin and myosin proteins that we need to build or synthesize in muscle from amino acids to promote growth of muscle cells and the overall growth of muscle. So this study shows that effective protein distribution throughout the day optimizes muscle protein synthesis. And if you look there in yellow, kind of the conclusion here, during 12-hour recovery period, after a single bout of resistance exercise, 20 grams of whey protein ingested every 3 hours was the optimal feeding pattern for promoting enhanced rates of muscle protein synthesis in this study. So again, this shows the importance of eating frequently. Again, I said 20 to 40 grams. I calculated my dose at, like 31 grams is what I needed to eat per meal based on my body weight. So again, eating frequently, an adequate dose of protein, you see the importance here after resistance training sessions. Now, before sleep, protein timing. So this is often kind of ignored or not thought of, but again, when you're sleeping, your body's in a fasting state, right? Because you're sleeping, you're not eating, right? And so the body enters this catabolic state. You tend to have more protein breakdown occurring throughout the night because you're just not taking in any calories for, let's say, an 8-hour period. Neither amino acid supply nor caloric energy is available throughout the night when you're sleeping to support muscle protein synthesis. So the result is the body cannibalizes its muscle tissue to harvest amino acids to support ongoing bodily functions, right? So maybe for energy production for cells, for example. You can eliminate the fast and preserve muscle protein each night by consuming a slow digesting protein prior to sleep. So this is where maybe supplementing or using casein before sleep could be beneficial because, again, when you ingest casein, remember this is a type of milk protein, and that enters the gut, it kind of clumps together, and as a result of it clumping together, those amino acids are released and absorbed more slowly from the GI tract into the bloodstream, and it kind of provides a steady stream of amino acids into the blood and into the muscle cells and other cells of the body throughout the night while you're sleeping. So this results in a steady, graded supply of amino acids entering the blood from the GI tract throughout the night. Protein ingestion before bed can increase muscle protein synthesis during sleep and kind of attenuate any muscle protein breakdown or degradation that may be occurring when you're in this fasting state. So here, this study, protein ingestion before sleep improves post-exercise overnight recovery. The conclusion of this study was that 40 grams of casein protein ingested 30 minutes before sleep stimulates muscle protein synthesis and improves whole body protein balance. So not just in muscles, it's throughout different organs and the different cells throughout the body during post-exercise overnight recovery. Title of this study, Protein Ingestion, published in the Journal of Nutrition. Protein ingestion before sleep increases muscle mass and strength gains during prolonged resistance-type exercise training in healthy young men. So here in this study, they looked at young men, I think they were college age, that did resistance training for 12 weeks. Can't remember how many times per week they were training, but 12 weeks total of resistance training with casein supplementation before sleep. And that casein comprised of 27.5 grams of protein, 15 grams of carbohydrate, and 1/10 of a gram of fat. So the results here, they found that athletes consuming the protein supplement before sleep increased muscle strength and cross-sectional area compared to those in the control group that did not. So again, with proteins timing before sleep, casein is the most commonly studied protein for overnight fasting. Casein may be impractical for some individuals to use, if they just don't want to spend the money, because it is a milk protein derived from milk. Its use is contraindicated in those that suffer from lactose intolerance, right? People that are lactose intolerant, they have a lack of the enzyme lactase, which breaks down milk sugar in the gastrointestinal tract, and so that creates the side effects that you see in those that are lactose intolerant, the diarrhea, the gas, all of those problems. So casein, people that are lactose intolerant are probably going to want to avoid casein. If that's the case, there are other protein sources that can be used to acquire those 40 grams of protein before sleep and induce some muscle protein synthesis overnight. So here's some just practical examples of these sources that you can ingest before going to bed. So 7 whole cooked eggs, a lot of eggs before bed there. That'll give you that 40 grams of protein. 5 cups of low-fat milk, assuming you're not lactose intolerant. 5 cups of low-fat yogurt, or 2 chicken breasts would get you up to that 40 grams of protein before going to bed. Now, if you're on a calorie restricted diet, right? So maybe you're trying to lose body fat, just to look better, to feel better for health reasons. Maybe you're a fitness competitor, bodybuilder, getting ready for a show, really trying to lean out, get your body fat down so that muscle that you're trying to build shows through on stage. So what do you want to do here? Well, when restricting calories, whole body catabolism and breakdown is occurring. So, most of the time calories are intentionally restricted to lose body fat. However, when you're in a calorie restricted state, there's going to be some breakdown of all macronutrients, of carbohydrates, of course, fat, and also of muscle protein. And we're wanting to spare muscle protein, right? You don't want to lose that. Most people want to keep their muscle and lose fat. So it's like, how do you go about doing this in a calorie restricted state? Well, it's important to keep your protein intake high, and I'll get into that here in a second. But in a calorie restricted state, your body tends to oxidize or burn with the help of oxygen in the mitochondria of your cells more amino acids. So remember that amino acids make up protein. In a energy restricted state, especially if you severely restrict calories. I don't ever recommend, if you're trying to lose weight, restricting your calories by more than 500 a day. You could restrict it more if you're extremely obese, but when you start restricting calories, the body's going to burn fat and use that fat as a fuel source. But it also, the protein that comprises muscle, some of the amino acids that make up that protein are going to get released. And those amino acids are going to be used, so you're breaking down protein, releasing amino acids, they're going to be used and oxidized to make ATP or energy for your cells to work when you're in a calorie-restricted state. So without care, excessive protein loss, the excessive release of these amino acids from your skeletal muscle protein can reduce lean muscle mass and may actually lead to impaired exercise performance, fatigue, etc., and impaired gains in strength and things like that. So resistance training and increased dietary protein intake during caloric restriction can help mitigate or attenuate, blunt muscle protein loss. So again, anytime you're dieting, you're in a caloric restricted state, do resistance training. That's going to help preserve muscle mass and muscle protein, bump up your protein intake, specifically increase your protein intake up to 2.3 grams per kilogram of body weight per day to help stave off and blunt that muscle protein loss when you're dieting. Although a slight caloric restriction, approximately eating 250 less calories per day than what you would need to consume to maintain weight, is suboptimal for stimulating maximal muscle protein synthesis rates. You can still grow some muscle mass while losing fat, even when you're eating in a calorie deficit, right? So Now, if you eat in a slight caloric surplus, let's say you consume 250 calories more per day than what you need to maintain weight, that would provide a more optimal stimulus for muscle protein synthesis. But if you start consuming, say, 500 more calories a day than what you need to maintain weight, or 1,000, yeah, that's going to really help trigger muscle protein synthesis, but also fat storage, because now you're consuming way more calories each day than what your maintenance level is. So again, just some things to think about. If you're slightly restricting calories, you can still stimulate muscle protein synthesis if your protein intake's high in your resistance training, but you probably will not grow as much muscle mass as you would as if you were in a slight caloric surplus and doing resistance training and taking in that surplus of calories each day. So take-home points here. If there's some points here to walk away with, it would be these. Athletes, older adults, especially elderly, and those wanting to maximize muscle strength and size need greater amounts of daily protein than sedentary individuals. Choose animal proteins if possible. They are complete proteins. They're going to have all the 9 essential amino acids. Or if you're vegan, just make sure you compensate by eating a variety of plant-based products and a larger overall amount of plant protein. Eat 4 to 5 protein-rich meals spread kind of evenly throughout the day. For example, breakfast, lunch, have your post-workout shake if you're running short on time, like whey protein. Dinner, and then before sleep, you would want to rely on a slower digesting and absorbing protein like casein. You could also ingest eggs, yogurt, or chicken. Get that 40 grams in before you sleep, okay? This will help to maximize muscle protein synthesis throughout the day and prevent or slow down muscle protein breakdown. Also aim for, in general, for most people, eating 20 to 40 grams of protein at each meal. I calculated mine based on my body weight. At each meal, I should eat around 31 grams to help maximize that muscle protein synthetic response each time I eat. If you're eating closer to 40 grams, that may provide a slightly higher benefit, as you saw on, I think it was the first graph I showed on maybe the second slide. If your main goal is to build muscle, eat at least your maintenance levels of calories or slightly more, a slight surplus. That's going to help optimize muscle protein synthesis. You need to increase protein intake if you're restricting your calories, say by 250 per day, so that you don't lose muscle and you still may be able to, again, stimulate muscle protein synthesis and build some muscle as long as you're doing resistance training and your protein intake is up when you're in that calorie restricted state. So there you have it. I hope all of those points and everything that I discussed in this episode of Fitness Facts is useful to you and your training, and hope you enjoyed it. See you next time.